Ed's body trembled uncontrollably. Maybe it was because Dumbledore had watched the battle from nearby and felt it more deeply than the professors and students who only arrived later and saw the dead ravens. Maybe it was because Dumbledore was simply so perceptive that he could read what Ed was feeling and had deliberately tried to comfort him. Whatever the reason, Dumbledore's few simple words had moved Ed. He opened his mouth but found his throat tight. When he tried to speak, the corners of his mouth were wet and tears streamed down his face. Many people knew that Ed loved animals, especially ravens, but they could not understand the bond between him and those birds. Ed took a deep breath, wiped his face with his sleeve, and feeling a little ashamed, said nothing. He bowed deeply to Dumbledore. Whatever the headmaster's motives, whether genuine or partly for show, Ed was sincerely grateful in that moment. Who else, if not him, would truly care about the lives of those ravens? They were ordinary creatures. Compared to the lives of the students, their deaths might seem insignificant. Dumbledore remembering them at such a time meant a great deal. "It is we who should thank these lovely little fellows for everything they have done for us," Dumbledore said with a quiet smile. The owl's graveyard was no place for just any bird. Only those owls that had served Hogwarts for generations, delivering letters and parcels, giving their lives in service to the school, were buried there. No other species had ever been laid to rest in that place. Now these ravens would be. Dumbledore's words carried both gratitude and consolation, but to Ed they carried something more. Without saying it outright, the headmaster made it clear that Hogwarts would treat the ravens differently from now on. If the school acknowledged them with a burial among the owls, then they were no longer merely wild birds that came and went. They would be recognized, domesticated in a sense, accepted as part of the castle. That recognition mattered. Even though some students had been fond of the ravens and would sometimes feed or keep them, officially they had not been part of Hogwarts. Dumbledore's decision as headmaster changed that. It was enough to alter, in a small but real way, the rules of this ancient place. Ed felt, suddenly and deeply, that his connection to the ravens remaining in the castle had grown stronger. Red Bishop and Black Knight looked around with puzzled, bright eyes. Their senses told them something about the castle had shifted, becoming warmer, more like home. As ravens, they could not put the sensation into words, but it felt to them like being closer to their master. Hogwarts itself had become another, quieter Ed. When the murmur died down, Dumbledore raised a hand and told the professors to see that the students were sent back to their common rooms to rest. He arranged for Ed, Harry, Ron, and Neville to be taken to Madame Pomfrey for treatment, and smiled at Ed and Harry, indicating that once they had recovered, they were welcome to join him for a spot of tea in the headmaster's office. In short, get treated first. We'll talk later. Hermione's eyes were red and puffy, and she refused to go back to the dormitory alone. She insisted on coming to the infirmary with Harry and Ed. Seeing her friends injured after she had been the one they were trying to save filled her with both gratitude and guilt. She had been crying from the start and had not stopped. If Ed had felt better, he would probably have tried to keep her at a distance, but he was too weak. Professor McGonagall waved her wand and produced several stretchers. Together with Professor Flitwick, she used levitation charms to lift Ed and Harry onto them. In the infirmary, Madame Pomfrey stared when she saw the state they were in. "Damn it, did you escape from the mouth of a dragon?" she exclaimed, taking in the injuries. She had worked in the infirmary for years and seen many odd things. She could remain calm even if a student turned into a toilet, but she had never seen injuries like these. What stunned her most was that with so many wounds, most people would be unable to move. Ed, however, was alert and seemed to be recovering bit by bit. It was simply unbelievable. There was no battle with a dragon. I merely knocked down a rampaging troll with my bare hands. For once, Professor McGonagall allowed herself a rare, sarcastic smile. Madame Pomfrey frowned. "That doesn't sound like a joke I want to laugh at." Professor Minerva McGonagall's expression went serious. "I'm telling the truth, Madame Pomfrey. These first years together subdued a rampaging troll. Had I not seen it myself, I wouldn't have believed it either." There was a short, tense silence. Ed thought he heard Madame Pomfrey mutter an expletive under her breath. Then Pomfrey began to scold. Not him, but the one who wasn't there to answer back. Honestly, bringing a dangerous creature like a troll into the castle, so careless. Look what's happened now. Thank goodness these children are all right. As she examined Harry and the others, Pomfrey couldn't help turning to Ed with a puzzled frown. What have you done, young man? Your wounds are bad, but none of them are fatal, and they're already starting to close up. Ed had no explanation that wouldn't sound mad. Before he could say anything, McGonagall interjected from the doorway. Don't worry about that, Pomfrey. Heal them as quickly as you can. Dumbledore has already given them basic care. You need only finish it. Pomfrey, still privately baffled, nodded and set to work, assuming Dumbledore had used some advanced charm. At that moment, Ed's stomach gave a loud, humiliating growl. He glanced up sheepishly and met the stern gaze behind McGonagall's spectacles. Even knowing why they'd all been in danger, McGonagall found the scene hard to smile at until she caught sight of Ed's embarrassed face and, almost despite herself, softened. So brave when you were showing off, she sniffed, and now you're hungry. What would you like? McGonagall asked, surprising herself by asking. I'll have the house elves prepare you something. Meat, fresh. Ed shot his hand up. Beef or lamb, medium rare, with some blood. I want it like that today. Asking a professor for raw meat was bold, but medium rare would do more for his recovery than anything fully cooked. McGonagall regarded him for a long moment, said nothing, and simply turned to go. Pomfrey raised an eyebrow but followed orders, and soon the infirmary was left with only the bandaged first years and their quiet chatter. Hermione sat on the edge of a bed, wiping her face. Stop it, Miss Know-it-all, Ed grumbled gently. You're embarrassing me. Hermione hiccuped and started again, tears welling. Why did you risk yourselves? That was a troll. How could you be so reckless? Ed reached out and smoothed her tangled hair. What did you want us to do? Stand there and watch you get clubbed to death? But, Hermione faltered. Words failed her. The idea that they had all rushed at a potion-fueled modified troll to save her should have been enough to stop her protests. She managed a shaky, all right. Ron, trying to sound braver than he felt, piped up from the other side of the room. We're friends. True Gryffindors don't back down, right, Harry? Exactly. Harry nodded. He turned toward Neville with a grin. Neville, you were brilliant today. At the crucial moment, it had been Harry, Ron, and Neville who charged out together, giving Ed the opening he needed. Neville, usually so timid and trembling when Snape scowled, had charged with them without a second thought. Seeing him roar into danger changed Harry's view of his classmate. It was one of those moments that proved the Sorting Hat had been right. Neville's courage flared when it mattered. Ron's chest puffed with pride, but there was a ripple of sheepishness, too. He half expected he'd have been the only one to rush in. He hadn't even realized Neville would follow. His surge forward had been an instinctive, embarrassing mixture of bravery and fear. Ed, propped on his pillow, offered a thumbs up. Beautiful incendio, Harry. I told you, you're the best. Among first years, that might have been the prettiest incendio I've seen. He gave Ron and Neville a thumbs up as well. And Ron, Neville, you weren't bad. That bit of help saved me a lot of trouble. They all laughed, bashful and relieved. Then Neville's face fell, and he mumbled, I broke the remembrall Gran gave me. Gran's going to write. Ed rolled his eyes affectionately. Don't sweat it, Neville. I bet Gran won't be mad. She's probably too proud right now, what with Hogwarts' Best Contribution Award and all. Chapter 103. Nani, can I use magic when I go back? Indeed, it was true. Few in the Longbottom family, or rather almost no one, had ever achieved such honors at Hogwarts. As his grandmother, she had been worried at first about how Neville would do at school. Though she was strict with him, she cared deeply. She wrote to Professor McGonagall asking her to keep an eye on her often forgetful grandson, and she wrote to Neville every week, listening to him describe his life at Hogwarts and quietly rejoicing when she learned he had made friends. She remembered the names of those friends, Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, Hermione Granger, and even Ed, long after Neville himself had forgotten that she knew them. Children often fear the stern looks of their elders, not realizing that behind those scoldings there is usually expectation and encouragement. Ed smiled, saying nothing more, watching Neville gradually relax. He stayed quiet, only feeling a little hungrier. Oh, right, Ed. What was that earlier? It was so cool, Ron blurted out, excitement in his voice. Harry and the others had wanted to ask for a while, but hadn't found the right moment, certainly not in front of McGonagall and the others. Ed smiled. I don't really know. It must be a special ability of mine. It's like a gift from the Red Bishop and the Black Knight. He added with a small grin, the Red Bishop and the Black Knight are my closest companions. I have a very deep bond with them. Professor McGonagall told me when I enrolled that this might be a wizarding talent, like the Dumbledore family's inheritance. They can summon a phoenix whenever they want. Mine is sort of a miniature version. I can't summon a phoenix, but I can summon these two, Red Bishop and the Black Knight. At Ed's praise, even the exhausted Red Bishop lifted its head proudly and stood at his bedside as if acknowledging the compliment. It had earned it. Ed reached out and stroked the two birds. He wanted to feed them blood as a reward for their hard work, but it wasn't the right time, nor did his current weakened state make it appropriate, and certainly not in front of the younger students. Thankfully, Red Bishop and the Black Knight were unfailingly understanding. Ed had come to love them both. He remembered when he first found them, two tiny ravens among a dense flock. He'd picked out the smartest, most nimble pair at a glance and formed a contract with them. They were close to him from the start. They accepted his bonding and even the feeding with no resistance, as if fate had brought them together. The boy, who had just activated the system and dared to dream, together with those two ravens, had sworn an oath under a great tree at dusk to be each other's most trusted companions. That really is an amazing talent, Ron said, full of envy. Even if it wasn't Dumbledore level, it was rare. Not like our Weasley family. I always thought the Weasleys' talent was the red hair, Ron added, half joking. It was hard to argue with that. The Weasley family's hair color did seem to be their most obvious mark. Still, most Weasleys were decent wizards. Talent ran through the family, even if not everyone was exceptional. Ron sniffed and said, Malfoy's always so smug. If we're talking bloodlines, Ed, you'd wipe the floor with him. Ancient wizard bloodline, Ron exclaimed, having swallowed Dumbledore's words and fully convinced of Ed's extraordinary heritage. Ed didn't contradict him. He only smiled. I don't know about all that. I'm an orphan. I don't know much about my family. Their conversation fell silent for a beat at that. Seeing their reaction, Ed quickly smiled again. All right, don't pity me. There's nothing wrong with being an orphan. He brightened. If any of you want, you could visit my orphanage sometime. Grandma Cynthia is a kind old woman, and the kids there are mostly obedient, though they can be mischievous. And remember not to scare them with magic, he added with a chuckle. Not that you'd get the chance. Once we leave school, new students can't use magic anymore. What? We can't use magic after leaving school? Harry asked, baffled. He'd never heard that before. He'd assumed that learning magic would at least protect him from being bullied by the Dursleys once he went back. Chapter 104, If the Teeth Were Smaller. Seeing Harry's expression, Ed immediately knew what he was thinking. He chuckled. Harry, are you worried about going home and getting bullied by your cousin again? Don't worry, he added with a grin. I'll come by your house during the summer holidays. I promise I won't use magic. He made a show of balling his fist. None of the brats near my old orphanage ever dared disobey after a proper talking to from me. A ripple of laughter ran through the first years. They had all seen what Ed could do. After all, the boy had taken down a troll single-handedly, so roughing up a few muggle kids sounded like child's play. Even Harry smiled at the thought of Dudley trembling under Ed's fist. Hermione, caught up in the room's lighter mood, let out a watery little laugh and said, Still, you shouldn't risk your lives. Next time, go find a professor straight away. Don't be reckless. That's enough, Hermione, Ron muttered. Where would we have found time to find a professor? Besides, if we'd been any slower, you might not be here at all. Hermione stopped talking at once. She choked on a sob, then, as if deciding to say what she'd been holding in, let the tears come. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sound like that. I know a lot of people dislike me. They say I'm arrogant or unreasonable because I'm from a muggle family. I know they don't like me. Harry's protest was instant. His usually dormant empathy now flared up. No way, Hermione. You're the best. We've never disliked you. Well, maybe sometimes found you a bit annoying, but Hermione laughed through her tears, then continued in a jumble. I'm sorry. I'm just so scared. I'm the only one in my family who can do magic. When I found out I'd be coming to a school like this, I was happy, but terrified too. I'm afraid I won't learn fast enough and they'll send me away. I'm afraid I won't be as good as you children from wizard families and you'll look down on me. Her words tumbled out in fits and starts. The others exchanged looks. None of them had expected the usually composed, competitive Hermione to have such fears. She told them about the nightmares, about being afraid every night that she wouldn't be good enough, how she hid by herself to cry. For a moment, the group felt ashamed. They had always called themselves Hermione's friends, but had they really noticed how worried she was? Ed sighed quietly. It fit what he'd suspected. Hermione was insecure, a sensitive, prickly little hedgehog whose quills weren't for hurting others, but for protecting the soft things inside. He smiled, reached out, and patted her hair. It's all right. You don't have to be afraid anymore. You're the best witch among the first years here, and you have us. If anyone ever bullies you again, tell me. As your big brother, I'll stand up for you. Hermione broke into relieved, laughing sobs. Who? Who said you're my big brother? Don't go acting older than me. Ed wasn't fazed. He laughed. I'm used to it. At the orphanage, I was the oldest, so I can't help looking at you lot like my younger siblings. The others looked a little speechless. They suddenly realized how Ed saw them, like a bunch of foolish younger siblings, and felt a little put out. We treat you like a friend, and you treat us like little brothers, they complained weakly. Hermione recovered a little, her eyes bright again. She looked at Ed earnestly. Thank you, Ed. Thank you for always being so good to me and looking out for me. Ed's mouth twitched. Isn't that what I should do? Call me Big Brother Ed, and I'll protect you forever. No, Hermione sniffed, turning away. Outside the infirmary, Madame Pomfrey shrugged helplessly and listened to the noises coming from inside, while Professor McGonagall pushed a food trolley loaded with paper trays and shrugged as well. Never mind, she said. Let them blow off some steam. Madame Pomfrey nodded. There were no other patients right now, so if these first years wanted to make a fuss, she would let them, but only this once. If they were this loud again, she wouldn't be so indulgent. She didn't want to see any of them back in here. First years getting into scrapes like this, charging a troll of all things, made her worried for what they'd attempt in their second year. Professor McGonagall's lips twitched almost imperceptibly at the sight of the food. Any Gryffindor who could see the professor now would be surprised to catch her smiling. As for Ed, a part of McGonagall thought he deserved a mild punishment for ignoring school rules and putting himself at unnecessary risk. But looking at his battered state, she decided mercy was better than scolding this time. She was also mildly stunned. A first year who charged a troll and won, she murmured to Madame Pomfrey. Rumors had already spread around Hogwarts that Ed might have ancient wizarding blood. After all, only someone extraordinary could have fought a troll in close quarters and come out on top. Conversation among the first years became livelier. After confronting her fears, Hermione seemed brighter than before. Her frequent, radiant smiles made both Harry and Ron pause, suddenly aware of how pretty she was. If only those large front teeth were a little smaller. Chapter 105, Bedside Night Talk. They say a little witch who smiles often has less bad luck. A smile can change everything. Hermione hadn't changed, really, but once she settled her thoughts and let herself smile, it altered how the young wizards saw her. Harry watched her with a new curiosity and then turned to Ed. By the way, Ed, you always seem to like helping people. I owe you for what you did back at King's Cross. Neville nodded. He hadn't forgotten that at King's Cross Station, Ed and Hermione had helped him find Trevor. To Ed and Hermione, it had been a small thing. To Neville, it was unforgettable. Well, Ed mused, then smiled. Maybe it's because so many people have helped me. I've had a lot of help in my life. So when I can help someone, I can't just stand by, he finished. That made the others curious. Because Ed was an orphan, they'd never pressed him about his past. None of them wanted to pry into painful memories. But after so long together, they had accepted him and had a sense of what he was like. Normally, they might have been embarrassed to ask, but tonight they lay on their cots after a shared fight, all bandaged and more open than usual. Harry couldn't help asking, half teasing, half sincere, "Come on, Ed. I still don't know what kind of life you had before. I'm curious. What kind of place raises a genius like you?" Harry felt the question deeply himself. Both he and Ed were orphans, but in different ways. Ed had been raised in an orphanage, Harry in his aunt and uncle's Muggle household. In personality, they were almost opposite. Despite both being well known at school, Harry had always resented his title as the boy who lived. Without it, he knew he wouldn't measure up to Ed in many ways. Ed stared out the window for a moment, a small smile touching his lips as he let the memory come. "It's simple, really," he said. "Grandma Cynthia always told me she found me on a snowy night under a big tree. I only had a note with my name on it, nothing else, and I was shaking from the cold. Grandma Cynthia said I was lucky. If a crow hadn't cawed so loudly from the branch above, I might have frozen." He chuckled, as if it were an ordinary tale. The others listened in silence. No wonder he liked ravens so much, they thought. What Ed didn't say at first was that when Cynthia found him, he wasn't the blank, helpless infant people assumed. He already had a small, fragile awareness. He remembered being awake in the cold, wrapped so tightly he could barely cry, waiting for the end. That memory of helplessness stayed with him. When Cynthia appeared, everything changed. She raised what became the Christie orphanage and later adopted Mia and several other children. Slowly, he grew up there. From that moment, he had always been grateful to the world. "So yeah," he said, "I guess I'm a lucky boy." "And later, when the orphanage was short on money, I started performing in the streets," Ed went on. He told them how he had saved half a year's pocket money and scavenged bits of refuse to get himself to the corner instrument shop. The owner, an uncle-y sort, sold him a battered second-hand violin that would go out of tune unless you were careful. There had been generous people along the way who'd helped him get by. When you can, people often reach out to those who are only just above the brink. "Ed, that's amazing," Hermione breathed. The others felt the weight of what he'd done. Learning an instrument in secret, earning money to keep an orphanage afloat, didn't come easily. Ed gave a small smile and turned toward Harry. "Harry, you haven't had the happiest few years, have you?" Harry fell quiet for a moment, then answered slowly. "It wasn't all bad. I used to think my aunt and uncle were very cruel. My cousin bullied me from when I was little. But the more I think about it, the more I think my aunt and uncle did what they could." He paused, choosing his words. "I didn't understand why they disliked me so much. After meeting Hagrid, I thought about it, and I'm starting to understand. They always told me my parents died in an accident, but they actually knew my parents were killed by the Dark Lord. They were muggles, ordinary people, and adopting a wizard child would have terrified them. If you ask me, I don't know why they adopted me at all. They could have put me in an orphanage or left me on the street." Chapter 106. Come on, let's see who is more miserable. "That's because Professor Dumbledore wouldn't allow it," Ed thought silently. If not for him, things would have gone the way Harry wanted. Ed grumbled inwardly. Given the Dursleys' behavior, it wouldn't have been difficult to throw Harry out or ship him off to an orphanage. Their feelings were complicated, sure, but as long as Harry's presence didn't threaten the family, they wouldn't have minded keeping him in an institution forever. Still, he knew better than to say that aloud. A little tact was necessary. Who knew? Dumbledore might be nearby listening. Old men could be crafty. Dumbledore wasn't the proud, infallible headmaster he once seemed. Age softened people. They began to long for the past, to hesitate, and to regret. It was an ailment that came for everyone eventually. He forced a smile and said, "I think it's because they're your aunt and uncle. No matter what, I'm sure some part of them cares about you." Harry managed a bitter shake of the head. "Don't be ridiculous, Ed. I always feel like they hate me, especially since Hagrid turned up. If anything, they'll hate me even more now." Ed could understand Harry's feeling. After all, something as humiliating as Dudley growing a pig's tail because of Harry would be hard for any parent to accept. But Ed also thought about how, when Harry first got his Hogwarts letter, the Dursleys hadn't simply dumped him. They took him all the way across Britain, trying to keep him away from magic. That showed they cared. Humans weren't plants. They had feelings. If they'd really wanted nothing to do with him, they would have refused him from the start. Once they'd taken him in, it was harder to get rid of him again. Dumbledore had waited so long not to create a timid, useless person for the Muggle world. If Harry truly were helpless, there'd be no point in Dumbledore's plans. "Harry," Ed said, hesitant at first, "have you ever thought about it from your aunt's point of view?" Harry frowned. Ed continued quietly. "That night you lost your parents. You weren't the only one who lost family." The words struck Harry like a thunderbolt. He went suddenly very still, lips parting without sound. The young wizards in the room fell quiet too, and even Professor McGonagall, sitting just outside the door, stopped her restless pacing and looked in. Dumbledore, who had entered unnoticed at some point, gave only the faintest shake of his head. Silence hung heavy until Ron, badly in need of breaking the tension, and apparently annoyed by a wispy pain at the same time, broke in with a grimace. "So, Neville, what about you? You seemed off when we were at Hagrid's." They'd wondered about Neville for a while. His shyness and awkwardness kept him from talking about his family, and that privacy had been respected. But tonight, everyone had already shared painful parts of themselves. Neville stiffened then. Encouraged by the atmosphere of trust, he looked down and spoke. "My parents, they went mad," he said finally. "They'd already been insane for as long as I can remember. The Death Eaters tortured them during the battle, and now they're at St. Mungo's. They don't recognize anyone." Tears streamed down Neville's face. The others understood at last why he'd never said a word before. Ed's voice was soft. "Neville, you should be proud of them. They're true heroes. If they ever get better and hear what you did tonight, they'll be proud of you too." Neville nodded, unable to make more of a sound. They all pretended not to see his tears. Ron cleared his throat, trying to steer the conversation away, but then Ed's half-smile turned on him. Ron's stomach tightened. "So what about you, Ron? With so many impressive older brothers, you must be under a lot of pressure, yeah?" The question hung there, a gentle prod, as the circle of friends sat together in the dim light, each carrying their private scars, each discovering how much less alone they were than they had thought. Chapter 107, You Promised. Ron was left a little speechless. In truth, there had been plenty of things he could have complained about before. Everything he owned at home was old and hand-me-down, always passed down the family line. Even his pet was a rat that had been handed from brother to brother until it landed with him. Mrs. Weasley rarely praised him. More often she sighed, "Your brothers are so wonderful," as if no matter what he did, he could never measure up. And it was true to an extent. Ron wasn't bad, just not exceptional. His brothers either shone brighter or had one outstanding talent that made him fade beside them. He felt, as he sometimes joked to himself, like an SR character with all B-rank stats in a 6-attribute system, versatile and with potential, but always overshadowed by SSRs or characters with at least one A or S stat. Those facts could have weighed on him. Yet for some reason, after hearing the stories of Harry, Ed, and Neville that night, his old grievances suddenly felt a little ridiculous. He scratched his head sheepishly. "You know," he said, "I don't really have much to complain about. Sure, I've always had hand-me-downs, and Mum always compared me to my brothers, but the truth is, she couldn't afford new things. And I've never been as brilliant as they are." "You can't say that," Harry interrupted, smiling. "At least they didn't win Hogwarts' Most Outstanding Contribution Award." Ron froze for a second, then burst into laughter along with him. A knock came at the door. Professor McGonagall's voice called through. "All right, everyone, it's getting late. Go and get some sleep. Mr. Moriarty, the kitchens have sent your supper up quickly." Ed's stomach gave an unhelpful rumble. He licked his lips and began to eat immediately. McGonagall looked over the group once more, warned them again to get some rest, closed the door, and left. She found herself puzzled that Dumbledore had evidently intended to speak to the students earlier, yet had suddenly changed his mind. A troll in the castle was far too dangerous an incident to let stand. If Harry and Ed hadn't gotten there when they did, Hermione Granger might not have escaped unscathed. The thought made her shiver. Still, she mused, these students had done remarkably well, true Gryffindors. And as she paced the corridor outside the Great Hall, she muttered under her breath about the Sorting Hat and wished that the little raven had ended up where she wanted, then shook her head and hurried toward Dumbledore's office to find out what had happened. Up in Dumbledore's office, Severus Snape stood opposite Dumbledore, his expression tight with anger. "You promised me you wouldn't let him, Harry Potter, do anything dangerous," he snapped. "Yes, Severus," Dumbledore replied calmly. Snape's jaw worked. "You know what I mean, Dumbledore. I don't care about your plan, but you gave me your word. You must keep it." Dumbledore regarded him with the same gentle steadiness he always wore. "Severus, you know as well as I do, he cannot simply be avoided. Others can be kept away from danger. He cannot always be." Snape cut in, furious. "I don't know what cleverness you think you have, but all I know is this. He is Lily's son. He must not be allowed to die. And you should have told me beforehand if you intended to let first-year children face a raging troll. I don't know whether you're mad or I am." Dumbledore let the remark pass and in that soft, almost amused tone he used when praising, said, "They won, didn't they?" Snape bristled. "They did? You were watching?" "I was close by," Dumbledore said. "They handled themselves admirably. Courage, quick thinking, the choices they made under pressure, there was no fault to be found. I confess I did not expect such excellence from first years." Dumbledore's eyes shone with genuine approval. "Mr. Moriarty was outstanding, as were Harry Potter and his companions. They have all greatly pleased me." Snape found himself grudgingly admitting, if only to himself, that without the use of dark arts, he might have struggled more against that troll. It had been larger, tougher than an ordinary troll. The destruction it had wrought in the Great Hall spoke to its exceptional strength. Snape suspected Dumbledore had had a hand in whatever made that troll so fierce. The whole scene bore Dumbledore's hallmark contrivances. He kept his suspicion to himself, however, as Dumbledore shifted the conversation. "How are things on your end?" Dumbledore asked. Snape snorted. "You know full well that fellow is trouble. During the chaos, he tried to slip back inside, but I intercepted him." "Then why did you let him come at all? Why make me forced to cooperate with him?" Snape demanded, the bitterness in his voice finishing the question. Dumbledore's eyes flicked over him, unreadable for a moment. He said nothing of the real reason, why that particular man could not simply be dismissed. He did not tell Snape that the man in question was not merely a dark wizard sent by an enemy, but someone who had once been Snape's superior. The detail would have unsettled Snape further, and Dumbledore chose to keep it quiet. Chapter 108, Can I Still Trust You? The main reason Severus Snape cooperated with Dumbledore was that they shared one thing in common. They both wanted to keep Harry safe. If Snape learned that such a dangerous person had gotten close to Harry, had had opportunity after opportunity to kill him during Defense Against the Dark Arts lessons, it would be a miracle if he did not lose control. Snape paced his office several times, agitated, then turned on Dumbledore, angry. "Fine. I don't care what scheme you're running, Albus, but I warn you, don't play with fire. And that boy, Ed Moriarty, don't be fooled by the performance. He isn't the obedient model student you imagine. He may be more cunning and more calculating than the Dark Lord ever was." "That sounds like your prejudice, Severus," Dumbledore replied softly. "You will admit, though, that there are sometimes young people who make us old ones feel ashamed of our complacency." Dumbledore went on with a gentle smile, unruffled. "We shouldn't let talent become a target of suspicion. That boy helped Ravenclaw win a great many points." "That's not," Snape began. "It has nothing to do with that." Dumbledore interrupted with a little laugh, then reached for a drawer, took out a sweet, unwrapped it, and popped it into his mouth. "Would you like one, Severus?" "No, thank you," Snape said brusquely. But Dumbledore only smiled. "I disagree with you. I have a feeling this child may surprise us in the years to come." "What are you planning exactly?" Snape demanded. "And that spell he used today." Dumbledore trailed off. "That spell is nothing to worry about. I can guarantee it," Snape said bluntly. "Guarantee? You saw it?" Dumbledore asked. He did not wait for an answer. Muttering more to himself than to Snape, he added, "Moriarty, such an old family name. I did not expect that prophecy to be true." Snape barely heard the last words. He did not care for prophecies or for the old surname. His agitation deepened into a low, hard resentment. Everything unfolding now seemed farther from what Dumbledore had once promised him. Dumbledore had pledged he would never let Lily's son be unnecessarily endangered, but watching from where he stood, it looked as if the boy was drifting into peril. Perhaps bringing Harry back into the wizarding world had been a mistake. Dumbledore, who had always seemed able to read him, grew serious. "Severus, you must remember one thing, that charm cannot protect him forever. When he comes of age, he will be the target. Better that he face some of these dangers with preparation now, when he is not alone. He is not alone. Mr. Ron Weasley, Miss Hermione Granger, Neville Longbottom, and even Mr. Ed Moriarty, they are all very capable in their own ways." Snape only snorted. If Ed was capable, Snape would admit it begrudgingly. Ed's competence irritated him, the way it bordered on arrogance and reminded him of someone he had once loathed. Hermione, he granted, was competent. Ron and Neville, in his estimation, were hardly more than ballast. But Ed, his brilliance was unsettling in the worst way. Dumbledore could only shake his head. Within the school, nearly every professor had been impressed by Ed, everyone but Snape, who watched him with hawkish suspicion. Perhaps Ed had unknowingly stepped on Slytherin pride by earning Ravenclaw so many points. Perhaps his achievements complicated parts of Dumbledore's risky plan. But Dumbledore saw value where others saw disruption. If Harry failed, there might still be someone to stand against that darkness in time. Young wizards matured quickly. Within a few years, Ed's power and skill could catch up with his intellect. If nothing else, Ed might provide an unexpected fallback. Dumbledore's expression turned grave. "I have laid out a plan, Severus, but I need to be certain of one thing." He searched Snape's face. "Severus, tell me, can I still trust you?" Snape did not answer with words. He raised his wand and sent a silver-white Patronus streaking past the window. The animal spirit flashed and flew, and in that quiet, Dumbledore took the response for all the reassurance he needed. The next day, Ed was discharged from the hospital wing. He left faster than Neville. Despite injuries that hadn't fully healed, there simply wasn't time to be idle. Ravenclaw had books to catch up on, and in the evening, Ed planned to tackle dungeon raids in the game to absorb more soul crystals. Madame Pomfrey inspected him from top to bottom, thoroughly baffled by his rapid recovery. "You're positively not human," she told him, as much in disbelief as in reproach. She suggested he check his lineage, just in case there were surprises hiding there. After a battery of tests and checks, Madame Pomfrey agreed to discharge Ed, along with Harry and Ron. Neville, however, had injured his leg badly and still needed to remain under care for a few more days. Watching Ed, who had seemed worse off, walk free while he remained confined made Neville's eyes sting. The one small consolation came in a letter from Gran, who had sent him a new remembrall and praised how Neville had not abandoned his classmates in a critical moment. She lauded his fidelity to family honor and, characteristically, omitted any mention of how close to death he might have been. It was the sort of stubborn, practical affection Neville's grandmother showed. She had known the danger, perhaps, but she would never put it into words. Chapter 109, Return of the Hero. Ed was dragged out of the hospital with Harry and the others before his injuries had fully healed. No sooner had they stepped into the castle than a crowd of younger students who'd already heard the news surrounded them, led by the Weasley twins. Before Harry or anyone else could react, they were hoisted into the air. Ed might have resisted, but seeing everyone so excited, he let them carry him along with the Gryffindor kids as if they were celebrating returning heroes. "Wait, why am I, a Ravenclaw, being carried to the Gryffindor common room? Put me down. I want to go back to my tower. I want to enjoy my senior sister's hospitality," he protested. The Weasley twins gave him no choice. Fred clapped a hand on his shoulder and crowed, "My God, mate, you've got guts like no one I've seen. If Charlie knew about you, he'd want to drag you off Hogwarts to help him raise those little scamps." Charlie, of course, had gone off to work with dragons. Ed inwardly prayed to steer well clear of that lot. Dragons were worse than trolls, not only in size but in magic resistance and their terrifying long-range breath. Someone else, George probably, bounced over and added, awestruck, "You're like a war god." Then he set off a firework that burst over the common room, spelling out in bright letters, "Welcome, Hogwarts war god." The twins were exuberant, and the Gryffindor kids caught the fever. There was a reason for their excitement. Though Ed was a Ravenclaw, Gryffindors adored bravery, and what he and Harry's group had done, rescuing Hermione, fit that bill perfectly. They were howling, pounding the tables, and lamenting why they'd obeyed professors and stayed in the common room instead of rushing to help. Some even chided Harry and Ron for not asking for help sooner. Harry could only shrug. The situation had made it impossible to find help in time. If not for Ed, who knew what might have happened? Ed would have agreed. If he hadn't shown up, Ron's levitation charm might have solved things without all this drama. Instead, he and some Gryffindors had spent 2 days in the hospital. Neville was still in the infirmary, all because they'd managed to find him in time to help. "I really am a man burdened with sin," Ed muttered to himself. He sighed and wondered how he would face Dumbledore. Logically, Dumbledore bore some responsibility for the chain of events, and yet Ed's feelings toward him were complicated. After everything that had happened, he found he could not bring himself to dislike the headmaster. In fact, he caught himself thinking something soft and foolish like, he'd die for a friend, Dumbledore is a good person. The thought surprised him. How had Dumbledore's smooth words wormed into him so easily? Dumbledore, a veteran of dark times, had a way with people that could charm even the cautious. Harry and Ron already seemed mesmerized by the headmaster. Ed didn't feel he could share these muddled feelings with anyone. Seeing Ed looking distant, Fred leaned in and asked, "Hey, what's wrong? Don't you like the welcome?" "I do," Ed said weakly, taking a lion-shaped hat Fred offered. The hat emitted an occasional realistic roar and looked ridiculous, enchanted with at least 3 different charms: fire, levitation, and transfiguration. Ed made a note to study how such layered charms were combined. With the twins still jabbering and pressing him for details, Ed only managed a helpless sigh. "It's nothing. I just feel like I've been played." The twins bombarded him with questions, but the little gathering didn't last long. Ed had to return to Ravenclaw and prepare for classes. After collecting his books, he went to the Great Hall. Although he'd had something to eat in the Gryffindor common room, he wasn't truly full. The Great Hall was packed. Everyone wanted to hear about what had happened that night. Only a few older students had seen the events firsthand. Most had only heard the story. Even the damage the troll had caused had been repaired. Dumbledore and several professors had restored the hall with powerful charms. It wasn't just the professors, Ed realized. Hogwarts itself seemed to mend faster than any ordinary building. The castle gave off the sense of being alive, automatically healing its wounds. Earlier, he hadn't noticed it, but now, having forged some kind of connection to the castle, he could sense that restorative quality directly. Chapter 110. We are very dedicated. Ed Moriarty glanced around, and sure enough, the younger students weren't eating. They had swarmed the Gryffindor table, circling Ron as he excitedly told his story. Ron had promised he'd keep a low profile when he came back, but faced with such an audience, he'd completely forgotten. Ed shook his head and lowered his head to his plate. The Ravenclaw senior girls were more restrained. They smiled and greeted him politely instead of mobbing him, which at least let him eat. From across the hall, Ed could make out Ron's voice. He'd noticed Ron's talent for storytelling the first time they'd met. If they'd met sooner, they might have made a fine comedy duo on the streets. Now Ron stood on the Gryffindor table, soaking up the adoring looks of the younger students as he described how his group had bravely defeated the rampaging troll. In his version, the troll had 3 heads and 6 arms, and the little wizards had used every trick they knew to outwit it. It didn't sound like a team effort so much as the tale of heroes slaying a dragon. Ed couldn't help but be a little incredulous. Dumbledore may have buffed that troll, but there was no need to turn it into an adult dragon that could have razed Hogwarts if they hadn't stopped it in the basement. Good times, alas, are brief. The chatter around Ron suddenly cut off. He looked up in confusion and saw Professor Snape moving through the doorway with a grim expression. His voice was cold and quiet, but it carried across the Great Hall. "Disperse, all of you. What are you doing? Professor Snape is here." The younger students scattered so fast, some of them tumbled to the floor, fell, scrambled up, and bolted for their house tables as if his shadow could burn them. Ed stared. Snape really could silence a room. The effect was something only McGonagall could match. One word from her, and the students would settle. Even Dumbledore rarely had that immediate hush. Snape's lip curled. It seems Mr. Weasley enjoys playing the hero. This is the Great Hall, not a stage. He turned that cool disdain on the Gryffindor table. Disrupting the order of the Great Hall. Gryffindor, 10 points from your house. Then his gaze landed on Ed, and the contempt sharpened. And Mr. Moriarty, knowing your companion was breaking the rules and not stopping him, indeed seeming to enjoy it. After such dangerous behavior, are you proud of yourself? I'm not. I didn't. Don't talk nonsense, Ed said blankly. He wondered if Snape had taken leave of his senses, why he was picking on him now. The answer came in the same clipped tone. For Mr. Moriarty's arrogance, Ravenclaw loses 5 points. Ed had the sudden urge to throw his fork at Snape's face, but he knew that would only invite more point deductions and detention, exactly the thing Snape would relish. He put his head down, finishing his meal quickly, and decided he'd make trouble for the Slytherin younger students later. If he couldn't touch Snape, he could at least pick on those beneath him. He ate in 2 gulps, plotting small mischief. Snape swept off toward the staff table, apparently satisfied. A scent of perfume drifted by, and a voice beside him said, "Junior student Moriarty has been making quite an impression lately." It was Penelope, the Ravenclaw prefect, sitting close enough that her knee bumped his. "I heard you single-handedly took down a troll unarmed," she said. Ed cleared his throat and subtly avoided her hand as she reached for his arm. "Don't get handsy, woman," his thoughts protested. "Not single-handedly. It was a group effort. Harry and the others helped a lot." That answer seemed to please her. Penelope's eyes brightened, and she gave him a look that appraised him from head to toe. He was taller and more solid than most students his age. If he'd claimed to be older, a casual observer might believe it. She moved closer, so close he could feel her breath and smell the faint perfume. He recoiled a little. Something about the way she pressed in felt deliberate. He had to admit she was beautiful, and she was very much his type in a simple, unavoidable way. Men notice beauty, whether young or old, gentle or fiery. What stuck was the look. That was loyalty of a kind, loyalty to what pleases the eye. But Penelope's intentions felt not entirely innocent. He kept his guard up and kept his answers short. Chapter 111. If you guys lie down, I'm the one who should be afraid, okay? But what kind of person is Ed, really? Third years are allowed to go to Hogsmeade, and in a sheltered place like Hogwarts, it's hardly surprising when students start finding girlfriends early. Young witches and wizards often begin to notice each other in their first or second years and only start openly courting in the third. Ed was only a first year, yet there was nothing infantile about him, not in his bearing at least. And Penelope Clearwater was hardly a shy girl. Compared with Hermione and the others who were still maturing, Penelope had fully blossomed into the most beautiful stage of her life. Ed admitted that she did have a certain appeal, but, important things deserve repetition. Girls would only slow down his wand work. He was here to pursue magic, not romance. There would always be pretty witches, but the years for learning magic were short. Wouldn't it be a waste to squander the golden years of rapidly increasing power on love instead of study? Ed recoiled inwardly, met Penelope's smiling, expectant look, and pretended not to notice the hint in her eyes. "Ah, Penelope, I suddenly remembered I left Black Knight's snacks back in the dormitory," he stammered. "I have to go get them." Black Knight, perched on his shoulder, chirped in puzzled protest. Hadn't it just been fed? Ed stroked the feathers at the back of its neck, and the bird closed its eyes in contentment. He got to his feet and made his escape. Penelope licked her lips slightly. She thought the little first year was being coy. No matter, she had patience. Outside the great hall, Ed smacked his lips to himself. Penelope had tried to make a move. He hadn't expected that. Making a pass was not impossible. Ed was considerably stronger than the average first year, but still, magic first. You had to choose. If he let these years slide, it could be years before he had the power to punch Voldemort in the face, let alone give Dumbledore a kick. He shook his head and sighed. The world was getting worse, and even a small, quiet wizard like him could attract the attentions of forward upper-class women. Hogwarts was full of dangers. As he rounded the corner, 2 girls in Ravenclaw robes suddenly hurried up to him. In the past, they'd only glanced from a distance. They'd never said a word. Now they stopped, wordlessly pressed a folded note into his hand, blushed all over, and ran off without looking back. Ed stared down at the envelope, bewildered. What on earth was going on? Between his inherited nickname, Ravenclaw's Raven, and the absurd titles people had started pinning on him, like Hogwarts God of War and Ravenclaw Wrestler, Ed felt the situation sliding out of control. The girls clearly had the wrong idea about him. The consequences were obvious. Professor Flitwick, during after-school tutoring, had casually reminded him, "We are wizards, Mr. Ed. We solve our problems with wands. Fists are for muggles." Ed blanched. Some of the Slytherins who had been a touch arrogant before were now suddenly deferential around him. When they saw him tuck his wand into his pocket and walk with empty hands, they treated him like a dangerous opponent. He found it exasperating. "You lot aren't trolls," he thought. "How can you be so thick-skinned?" He worried that if he actually punched one of them, he'd turn them into an idiot. And then, what if they wound up flat on the floor? He'd be the one left feeling guilty. "If you guys lie down, I'm the one who should be afraid, okay?" After Halloween, things at school had shifted a little, but not enough to disrupt Ed's study routine. The main snag was Hermione, who refused to sit next to him in the library. She was offended. Apparently something he had done recently had put her in a sulk. Hermione still had little moods that needed calming, he decided. She would require some gentle training. One day she dug through Ed's school bag and found a stack of letters mixed in with his books. "Huh? Ed, why are there so many letters in here?" she asked, flicking through the envelopes. When she saw the names and hints written on them, her face went so dark it looked like she might cry. Her expression said everything: disgust and hurt. Before Ed could explain, a cluster of older girls who didn't usually come to the library converged on him under the pretense of borrowing books and thrust more notes into his hands. Hermione watched this with growing fury, snapped her book shut, and moved to a different table with a huff. From there, she kept stealing glances at him, looking at him as if to say, "Come and make it up to me." Ed, naturally, pretended not to notice. He still had a lot to teach her about patience. Ron, on the other hand, stared at him with envy. He couldn't understand how the quiet kid who'd fought trolls could suddenly be so popular. Ravenclaw did have a number of attractive upper-class women, and apparently they had decided Ed was worth writing to. But why hadn't any written to Harry? It seemed unfair. Ron's face was full of baffled suspicion about life itself. Ed thought for a beat, gave Ron a friendly pat on the shoulder, and said, "Maybe you look a little too young right now." "But Harry's small too," Ron protested. Ed looked down at Ron. He was a head shorter than Ed, and then at Harry, who was about the same height as Ron. Ron's complaints didn't have any evidence, Ed thought, but the little lad at least had the right to be puzzled. Life at Hogwarts had quietly changed after Halloween. More whispers, more notes slipped into hands, more sideways glances. For Ed, though, the plan stayed the same. Magic came first. Everything else could wait. Chapter 112. Playing ball turns into hitting people. As they chatted, a few more Ravenclaw senior girls arrived and sat down nearby. Harry and Ron exchanged a look, then sensibly got up and scurried back to the Gryffindor stands. When they returned, they found Hermione stabbing at the roast beef on her plate with a knife and fork, as if it were a mortal enemy, her gaze fixed on Ed, who was laughing and talking with the Ravenclaw seniors across the way. Hermione hacked a piece off the beef, jammed it into her mouth, and bit down hard. "Ow, damn it!" she cried, covering her mouth. Harry, Ron, and Neville heard the sickening sound of teeth hitting something unyielding. It sounded painful. Shortly afterward, Hermione had to go to Madame Pomfrey. She'd accidentally bitten a bone while eating and needed dental attention. Fortunately, for a wizarding minor injury, teeth treatment wasn't difficult. Madame Pomfrey quickly put things right with a restorative charm. But when Hermione came back, Harry and the others felt something was different about her. They couldn't put their finger on it, and Hermione wouldn't say. They even lost 10 points in Snape's class for being distracted by the mystery, and that still didn't help. It wasn't until they saw Hermione smile and greet Ed that it clicked. Her front teeth looked different. She seemed to be missing her front teeth. The weather in Britain had always been gloomy, Ed knew that well from his years in London. Now that he was at Hogwarts, it was the same. November had turned viciously cold, and daylight hours were shrinking. The afternoon was already dim when the students gathered. Still, the mood in the stands was electric. This was Harry's first Quidditch match for Gryffindor against Slytherin. Hermione sat with a sullen pout, while Ron and Neville sat stiffly beside her, pretending not to notice. The three had been excited that morning, hurrying to the match together. But why had Ed come too? And why had he brought Penelope, a beautiful Ravenclaw senior, with him? Penelope cheerfully greeted Ron and the others and flashed an extra bright smile at the obviously upset Hermione. Somehow, seeing Hermione irritated lightened Penelope's mood. Her annoyance at Ed for skipping the Ravenclaw game faded. Penelope had originally hoped to take Ed to watch the Ravenclaw-Hufflepuff match, but Ed had already promised to cheer at Harry's debut. Not one to take no for an answer, Penelope had simply joined him at the Gryffindor match instead. Ed couldn't refuse. He wasn't about to dictate other people's choices. If he was honest, Ed wasn't that into Quidditch. He enjoyed broom riding. The speed and rush were a lot like Muggle street racing, only airborne. But the sport itself struck him as rough and full of loopholes. The rules and scoring seemed crude compared to many Muggle sports, and dirty tricks, knocking or pushing players off brooms without anyone being ejected, made some matches more like brawls than competitions. Because of that, he figured a game between Gryffindor and Slytherin could easily go from playing ball to playing hardball. Even so, Quidditch was wildly popular in the wizarding world. There were Quidditch World Cups, and cup players were household names. Ed accepted that it was one of those things others loved, and he didn't have to. But this was Harry's first match. As a friend, he should be there to show his support. Chapter 113, Slytherin Bullying. If there was one good thing to be said about Quidditch matches, it was the same quality that makes sports popular everywhere. On the pitch, most forms of prejudice get put aside as everyone pours themselves into the game. Whether a player came from a Muggle family, a pure-blood line, or was half-blood, as long as they performed well and looked the part, they could win cheers and even a handful of fangirls. Even with his limited knowledge of Quidditch, Ed knew that some of the sport's biggest names were from Muggle families, and no one cared about that once they were famous. There was also the matter of Harry. As the boy who lived, he already attracted attention wherever he went, and the joint effort against the troll had only boosted his popularity. On top of that, he was the first year ever to make the school team, which made everyone curious. Wood had been keeping him as a secret weapon, giving him private training in the closed pitch, and rumors about what Harry might do now had spread across the houses. So even though Gryffindor and Slytherin were the teams, many Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs had slipped over to watch, even when their own house teams were playing nearby. People wanted to see if this savior lived up to the legend or was just another show-off. Everyone knew Professor McGonagall had put a lot of thought into Harry's place on the team, and lately she'd been unusually permissive with the Quidditch pitch. Many requests to use it had been turned down because, as the notices went, that Quidditch pitch has been reserved by Professor McGonagall for Gryffindor. All the houses wanted to see what this Gryffindor side, apparently under McGonagall's special protection, could actually do. Slytherin, by contrast, drew less sympathetic attention. Their team had always been strong, but the strength often seemed to come from dirty tricks rather than skill. It was hard not to see Slytherin as a product of their head of house, taught to be shameless and to do whatever it took to win. In the classroom, Snape used his position to favor Slytherin, piling on house points with a heavy hand. On the pitch, his influence seemed to show up in subtler but equally unfair ways. Looking at the Slytherin lineup, it felt less like a team and more like a pack ready to fight. That, in fact, had often been their strategy. Tiny, vicious moves meant to intimidate and hurt opponents until they crumbled mentally or physically. Plenty of students found it hard to resist the urge to pull out their wands and blast a few of those gorillas off their brooms. The match's broadcast opened with a friendly, almost conspiratorial greeting, sprinkled with praise for Gryffindor and sneers at Slytherin. Ed didn't need much to recognize who was commentating. Lee Jordan, the Weasley twins' friend, and the voice of Gryffindor fandom. Lee was in full swing, profusely apologizing for any previous indiscretions to Professor McGonagall, but his memory was short and his jibes continued. He couldn't resist mocking Slytherin as he spoke. His partisan style lit up the stadium. Gryffindors waved and hollered themselves hoarse, and even some Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs were swept up in the noise and cheered for Gryffindor. Slytherin had never been beloved. Ed suspected Snape was at least half the reason for that, especially with this crop of seventh years, the ones who'd been under Snape from their first to seventh year. Their worst traits were obvious. They hadn't learned much that was admirable, but they'd picked up the Slytherin temperament in full. Arrogance, malice, and a willingness to use underhanded spells. Unfair privileges had made some students blind to their own lack of merit. Most of the reported bullying around school came from these older Slytherins. The new first years of Slytherin were better behaved, partly because Ravenclaw had people like Ed keeping them in check, and partly because Gryffindor now had Harry and Ron defending their fellow students. Ron, especially, had proved he belonged as a prefect. When his classmates were in trouble, he and Harry stood up for them. As a result, the youngest Slytherins these days kept their heads down. They rarely tried to pick fights they couldn't win. But the older Slytherins were a different matter. Compared to students from the other houses who'd actually worked at their studies, these seniors truly earned the label malicious. They might not have mastered anything noble, but they knew plenty of nasty curses and tricks. In house rivalries, they tended to have the edge. As Ed's thoughts churned over all this, the referee raised his arm and blew the whistle. The match was about to begin. Chapter 114, Senior Sister is So Mean. From their seats, the other first years could only make out little figures darting and circling above the Quidditch pitch. Faces were impossible to see at that distance. But with Ed's enhanced sight, he could pick out Harry high above them, getting a feel for his broom. When the whistle sounded, Harry climbed to the very top of the pitch and began to circle, scanning the air for the golden snitch. As a seeker, Harry's whole job was to find that tiny, fast-moving ball. Catching it would end the game and award 150 points, enough, if the rest of his teammates held their own, to decide the match. Ed's eyes flicked across the field. With his sharper vision, he searched for the snitch. It was maddeningly elusive. Sometimes he caught a flash of gold that vanished a heartbeat later. It might even have been outside the pitch at times. What he could see was that even he only glimpsed it briefly. The other first years wouldn't notice unless they happened to be looking at exactly the right moment. Most of the spectators were riveted by the scramble of players down below, the chasers and beaters clashing, but Ed's attention stayed almost entirely on Harry in the sky. He remembered the original plot, where Harry's broomstick developed problems, but at the start of this match, there was no sign of that. Harry's speed up there was unmistakable. The Nimbus 2000 beneath him made him noticeably faster than the others. Professor McGonagall had kindly provided it. How much of her salary that had cost was anyone's guess. Hogwarts professors earned respectable sums, but not luxury money. Buying a top broom was a real expense. McGonagall must have paid quite a lot to get it, which said something about how much she cared about Quidditch. Gryffindor hadn't claimed the Quidditch Cup in a long time, and McGonagall, who'd been an excellent player in her youth, clearly took the game seriously. Her support for the team wasn't surprising. Every head of house naturally preferred their own house. That kind of partiality was ordinary, nothing like the blatant favoritism the students loathed in Snape. The crowd's energy built as the match went on. Even Hermione, who usually had little interest in Quidditch, got swept up in it, waving and cheering with the Gryffindor first years. When Slytherin played dirty, Lee Jordan let rip over the commentary, and the Gryffindor younger students erupted, shouting and jeering at the Slytherins. That stirred Hermione and the rest even more. She found herself swept up among them, cheering like the others. Ron and Neville were equally animated. Ed admitted to himself that his earlier dismissal of Quidditch had been narrow-minded. Standing there, he could see the appeal of competitive sport, especially at Hogwarts, where the Sorting Hat's division of students into houses made house pride intense. Sitting among a pack of Gryffindor first years, It was hard not to be infected by their enthusiasm. Luckily for his composure, he was a Ravenclaw and could keep a clearer perspective. Penelope beside him was in the same position. As a Ravenclaw prefect and someone who'd seen many matches, she hadn't come for the spectacle so much as to keep him company. She would have preferred to be cheering for Ravenclaw, but she knew how quickly a junior could be swept away by older students. Better to secure him now than lose him to another senior girl's attentions. She leaned closer to Ed when the crowd's attention drifted. With the noise around them, leaning in was the only way to be heard. Her movement was subtle but practiced. If it had been some other, more naive first year, Penelope's three-pronged approach might have carried him off entirely. Her breath warm against his ear, she murmured, "I heard from the other first years that your broom's pretty good, Ed. Have you ever thought about trying out for the Quidditch team?" The roar from below made it hard to catch her words. Ed turned his head so their mouths were close and shouted back, "No, I'm not planning on joining. I've got a lot of magic to learn. No time for that." He leaned back a fraction and added, quieter this time, "Besides, being good at flying doesn't mean you're good at Quidditch. They're completely different." Chapter 115. Obviously, I came here first. Of course, that was Ed being modest. Competitive sports measured a player's fitness and reflexes, and in both those areas, he utterly outclassed the younger students. Add in the fact that he felt no fear of heights or danger, and even without any Quidditch experience, Ed was confident he wouldn't be out of place on the pitch. Whenever something required physical ability, he reduced the field to a single dimension, himself. He wouldn't claim to be the most powerful magic user at Hogwarts, but in a fight with fists or skillful maneuvering, he would not be troubled. Put down your wands, wizards. Line up your entire year, and you wouldn't be enough for one of Ed's hands. Penelope, however, was persistent. She leaned closer and whispered, "Being a first year doesn't matter. Harry's a first year too, isn't he? Professor McGonagall gave him permission. Professor Flitwick wouldn't mind giving you one either." As if Flitwick hasn't already asked me about this, Ed thought with an eye roll. What were the Ravenclaws dreaming of? Ravenclaw would be lucky to take the House Cup this year, and yet they wanted both the House Cup and the Quidditch Cup. Dumbledore would never allow that. Ed privately suspected that even if Gryffindor finished last in points and lost every Quidditch match, Dumbledore would find a way to make sure Gryffindor still walked away with some trophy. If Ravenclaw did win the House Cup this year, it would feel like a special concession from Dumbledore. The Quidditch Cup was another story. If Gryffindor missed out on the House Cup, Dumbledore would make sure some other prize reinforced Harry's importance and the house's collective pride. Penelope didn't know any of that. She watched Ed with an expectant smile when he showed no sign of being tempted and reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, a tiny, practiced gesture that made her seem even lovelier. "If you're interested," she said, "you could always practice with the school team first. See how you adapt. I'm close with the captain, Davies. He'd help you get started." Goodness, the senior was practically laying it on thick to hook up with a first year. Ed thought that if he'd been a more vulnerable newcomer to Hogwarts, faced with such a considerate and pretty senior, he might have been done for. Bah, what had Hogwarts come to? Why were the girls obsessing about chasing juniors instead of studying? When would Ravenclaw pull itself together? Ed politely declined. Penelope didn't get angry. She seemed to accept his refusal, but she also realized he genuinely had no interest in joining the team. His attendance at the match seemed to be mostly to watch Harry. Ever since the game started, his gaze had been fixed on Harry alone. Penelope could only sigh inwardly at the easy camaraderie among the first years and began, as any longtime Ravenclaw would, to introduce the players on the field. Thanks to her, Ed finally put names to faces. He already knew most of the Gryffindors, Harry, the twins, and a few others he could guess at. Slytherin's lineup was mostly unfamiliar, but Penelope's explanations filled in the gaps. The match was enjoyable. It even improved Ed's opinion of Quidditch a little. Still, the idea of dedicating a day or two a week to practice was out of the question. Time was precious. He barely had any free time left for games. Where would Quidditch training fit in? Even if he joined Ravenclaw's team, He'd likely be riding along with Harry on a losing streak this year. He had no desire to be a guaranteed loser, even for a friend. He wasn't interested in being a stepping stone. Ed's principle was simple. If you could be beaten fairly, it was acceptable, but losing to tricks or slights, no matter the result in the record book, was unacceptable to him. What Ed didn't notice was Hermione's reaction. She had been cheering for Gryffindor, but her cheering grew quieter and more strained. She glared at Ed and Penelope as they chatted, and when Penelope, almost casually, glanced back at Hermione, smiled brighter, and leaned in a little closer to Ed, Hermione felt a hot twinge of jealousy. It wasn't that Hermione had been romanced by Ed. At 14, most of them weren't thinking about romances, but she had prided herself on being Ed's closest female friend. Now it seemed there were always new girls crowding around him, and Ed had less and less time for her. That stung. Her anger had cooled somewhat since the first day she'd seen Ed's flood of love notes, but now it flared again. She watched, conflicted and annoyed, while Neville and Ron whooped and waved their arms at the action on the field, completely oblivious to her mood. The match went on, loud and bright, but in the stands a small, complicated drama smoldered, one that had nothing to do with Quidditch and everything to do with the precarious balance of friendship and attention among the first years. Hermione muttered under her breath, indignation burning in her chest. What was so special about that woman? Slightly prettier, larger breasts, longer legs. Sure, attractive, but not enough to justify that kind of intimacy. It had taken her and Ed ages of studying together before their relationship seemed close. This woman had met Ed only a few times, and already they looked as if they were going to become a couple. Damn it all. For the first time, but the young witch vaguely understood what it meant to be a hot commodity, and how, if you don't act, plenty of others will. The pressure she felt suddenly outweighed even her academic anxieties. It felt harder than earning second place in the year. Before Hermione could sink further into those resentments, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. The previous noise fell away, replaced by tense silence. Hermione looked up and saw Harry in the air, his broom behaving erratically, wobbling as if trying to toss him off. Then she noticed Professor Snape in the stands, watching Harry with a dark, muttering expression. A thought flickered through her mind. Could Snape really be trying to harm Harry, as many suspected? Ed was tense at first, too. When he saw Harry's broom begin to falter, the Red Bishop and the Black Knight perched on his shoulders, beat their wings, and took flight. But they didn't swoop in to grab Harry. Ed had issued clear orders. They were only to intervene if Harry actually fell off the broom. Those commands weren't complicated, and with the intelligence they possessed, the Red Bishop and Black Knight understood perfectly. Harry gripped the broom with a white-knuckled hand as the sudden jolts nearly pitched him off. He feared he might be falling to his death the next second. Then he noticed the Red Bishop and Black Knight circling him, flying close enough to ward off a real fall. Clever and practical, Harry immediately understood what that meant and why Ed hadn't acted sooner. Once he realized he wouldn't plummet to his death, his panic eased and strength seemed to flow back into him. Strangely, the broom's shaking began to subside for reasons he couldn't see, and he fought to steady himself and climb back onto it. Ed let out a relieved breath. Mostly that relief was because he had just seen Dumbledore appear on the podium. That reassured him more than anything else. He didn't understand why Voldemort would attempt such a crude, blatant act. An unskilled assassination didn't fit the Dark Lord's usual cunning. Voldemort should have been more concerned with questioning Harry about escaping the killing curse, not in a rush to kill him. Still, someone had clearly targeted Harry that day. With Dumbledore in the stands, however, Ed felt Voldemort's plans wouldn't continue unchecked. Ed thought carefully about what had happened. From the outside, this had seemed like a straightforward accident, but being where he was, and remembering the thoughts from that Halloween night, he suspected this wasn't Voldemort's handiwork. It was too crude and simple for the Dark Lord. More likely, Quirrell had acted on his own. Whether Quirrell did it to attract Dumbledore's attention, or because he was trying to placate the Dark Lord while secretly hoping to get rid of him, were very different motives. Both led to Quirrell opposing Harry, but one suggested Quirrell still had some sanity left. The other suggested he'd completely abandoned hope and fully sided with the Dark Lord, who, in any case, wouldn't care about Quirrell's life. Quirrell, Ed thought, was one of the most tragic figures in that first year. From the moment he appeared, his fate had seemed sealed. Ed sighed inwardly. There was nothing he could do to interfere. He was keeping as low a profile as possible with respect to Voldemort. He hadn't tried to stand out in defense against the dark arts. His answers in class were always by the book, never straying beyond the curriculum to attract attention. He suspected that after that Halloween night, he might already be on the Dark Lord's radar, and he didn't want to make it worse. Back in the air, Harry managed to get himself back on the broom. The violent jolting had stopped. And incredibly, even amid the chaos, he managed to catch the golden snitch, using his mouth. The snitch flew straight into his open jaw. It was hard not to suspect that Dumbledore had been spoon-feeding him. Chapter 117, A World Where Only Malfoy is Hurt. Gryffindor had finally defeated its mortal enemy, Slytherin. The stands erupted in cheers. The little lions went wild, and even the younger Gryffindors from Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff who had come to watch were swept up in the excitement. Only the Slytherin side looked as if they'd swallowed something foul. Understandable, since Slytherin had spent more time hitting people than playing the game, making for a thoroughly disgraceful performance. What was worse, after all that dirty play, they still lost. The self-important looks on the Slytherin students' faces had turned to dark scowls as they drifted away from the pitch, grumbling. Nobody paid them any mind. Lee Jordan, still breathless with excitement over the commentary booth, loudly announced Gryffindor's victory and kept calling out the name of their biggest contributor, Harry. Anyone could see that Gryffindor had been faltering under Slytherin's tactics. It was Harry's decisive capture of the golden snitch that abruptly ended the game and secured the win. He was the undisputed hero of the match. Ed stood and applauded Harry's stunning catch. The Red Bishop and the Black Knight flapped back from the field and landed on his shoulders. Ed turned and noticed Hermione was gone. Nearby, Snape's robes were smoldering, and the professor was frantically patting them out, clumsy and awkward like a penguin. In one of his great flailing movements, he even knocked Quirrell over. Quirrell ended up sprawling on his back. Watching this, Ed couldn't help but think Snape had staged the whole thing to settle a personal score. He'd extinguished the flames with his hand instead of a quick wand flick, and in doing so, had sent Quirrell flat. Would Voldemort remember this when Snape inevitably returned to him? Given Voldemort's pettiness, Ed figured he almost certainly would. Only the timing of the revenge was uncertain. At the edge of the pitch, Ron Weasley and Neville Longbottom were scuffling with Malfoy. Crabbe and Goyle were there too. In a straight brawl, Neville and Ron weren't as strong as them, but after time with Ed, they'd learned how to fight. Attack where the opponent must defend, and pick on the weakest link. Between Ron and Neville, Malfoy was getting a rougher time than he expected. When Ed walked over, the fight halted by mutual, unspoken agreement. Malfoy glared at Ron and Neville, muttered, "You'll pay for this," and slunk away with Crabbe and Goyle. They'd heard rumors that Ed's punches could fell a troll, and given their scrawny builds, it was wiser not to linger. It was said, ludicrously, that although Ed excelled at charms, he preferred to fight without magic, with his fists, and that he took a perverse delight in the opponent's screams. How such an absurd rumor had spread across Hogwarts was anyone's guess, but some people now treated Ed like a fearsome brute. Penelope watched all of this with a chuckle. "Ed, you really do have quite the reputation," she said. Ed shrugged. Slytherin's bullying was notorious, and for someone like him to walk over and send them running felt like a genuine feat. "Don't tease me," he answered. "They ran because they saw you next to me." As Ravenclaw's prefect, Penelope could have docked points from Malfoy and his cronies, and she smiled at the suggestion. "Ed, want me to take points off Slytherin?" Ed shook his head. "No, it's not worth it." If she deducted points from Malfoy, Gryffindor would likely lose points too. Ron and the others might even face punishment. Better to let it go while the professors were distracted. Ron and Neville waved him over. "Good thing you showed up, Ed," Ron said. "Crabbe and Goyle, what do they eat to get so big?" He preened for a moment, then added, "Did you see how rotten Malfoy looked? He acted like I wouldn't hit him." Thanks to Ed's timely arrival, only Malfoy had come away worse for wear. Ron and Neville were smug, no major damage done. Hermione returned from somewhere, expression composed, showing no hint of the little witch who had just set a professor's robes on fire and nearly cost Gryffindor 50 points. She'd learned mischief fast. In 2 years, she might not only burn robes, but be brazen enough to send Snape flying with a stupefy. When she got reckless, Hermione could be even more ruthless than Harry and Ron, those two bumblers. As Gryffindor's resident know-it-all, she immediately assumed the posture of a good student and started scolding Ron and Neville without mercy. Penelope smiled and fell into step beside Ed as the crowd began to disperse. Even though he was only a first year, Ed was very tall, almost half a head shorter than her, and with the way kids grew at that age, she had no doubt he'd probably be taller by the time she saw him next year. She turned to him and asked, smiling, "Christmas is next month, Ed. Do you have any plans? Are you going to stay here or go back to the Muggle world?" Chapter 118. Boys should protect themselves outside. "I heard your home is an orphanage, Ed. It might not be convenient for you to go back for the holidays." Penelope's look was pointed, and Ed sighed inwardly. Senior Penelope really had to stare at her junior like that. Wasn't he allowed a rare break? If he stayed, she'd probably announce she was staying too, and then insist on getting closer, bonding, and all the rest. He couldn't let a forward senior take advantage of him. Boys should know how to protect themselves outside. So Ed hesitated, then said, "I haven't decided yet. If I do stay, I'll let you know, Penelope." Penelope looked mildly offended, obviously reading the evasiveness in his tone. "A beautiful senior making all the moves. What were you waiting for, little wizard?" Still, she smiled and looked for another angle. "Professor Flitwick mentioned your progress in charms, Ed. He said you're almost catching up with 5th and 6th years." Ed felt his face heat. Had Flitwick been praising him in front of the older Ravenclaws? The thought of the professor saying, "Even a first year beats you lot," to the clumsier 5th years made him sweat. Was Flitwick trying to make enemies for him? He appreciated the praise, but there was no need to advertise his ability so widely. Penelope pressed, smiling. "Coincidentally, I've been struggling with some charms lately. Some of them need practice partners. Would you help me?" Ed was speechless for a moment. He tried to stall. "Penelope, aren't 5th year schedules supposed to be packed with owl prep?" They were. 5th years were swamped with owl preparations. Their timetables were practically doubled compared to first years. Ed had long suspected that Hogwarts faculty must be hiding a time turner to handle the 7 years' worth of classes with so few teachers. Even if lower years had fewer classes, there were still weekly lessons, sometimes overlapping. How did the professors do it? If he ever found a free time turner, becoming a professor didn't sound bad. Care of magical creatures seemed ideal. Let a few dangerous beasts loose occasionally, and many students would steer clear. He could take it easy, draw a good salary, and spend spare time in the library. Kicking Trelawney out of divination crossed his mind. After the Dark Lord's defeat, who would hound her about that old prophecy? But then he felt that would be disrespectful. He'd figure out which class needed a teacher later. If he worked hard enough, he could probably teach anything. Lost in those daydreams, he almost missed Penelope slipping away, exasperated. "Junior still not captured. Senior will just have to try harder," she muttered. By mid-December, despite his earlier refusals, Ed had given in to several joint charms practice sessions. He had to admit Penelope was impressive. Academically, not in any other way. As a Ravenclaw prefect, she ranked among the top in her year, and she had genuine insights into advanced potion-making and charms. She gave him useful guidance on the higher-level spells he'd been attempting, and many of his own approaches had startled her in turn. What had started as her trying to tutor a junior had become true mutual study. "Stupefy!" Penelope cried from a short distance, aiming a full-power stunning bolt. Ed flicked his wand once, and an armor-like barrier sprang up, a transparent, domed arc that absorbed the spell and held it at bay. "Your shield charm keeps getting better, Ed," Penelope said, genuinely impressed. At first, his barrier could only shrug off minor magic. Anything stronger would break through. Now, even a full-strength stupefy bounced off. Ed smiled. Thanks to your help, Penelope, but it still isn't perfect. My shield charm has a long way to go. You're too modest, she replied, shaking her head. There might not be a single fifth year with a better shield charm than yours. Flitwick was right. You're a prodigy. Ed felt embarrassed by the praise. He didn't argue. After all, it was true. But he wasn't wrong to claim the charm wasn't mastered yet. He still had work to do. Aid was still trapped in the Ravenclaw common room instance, swarmed by hundreds of thousands of book monsters that kept thwarting any attempt to break the stalemate. His shield charm could sustain his body and repel attacks, but it lasted for less than 3 seconds. Even if he cast it repeatedly, the books shredded each barrier almost as soon as it formed. He could use the firewall to deal area damage, but it wasn't enough to wipe them out before his shield broke. After that, he would either exhaust himself or have his defenses broken by the remaining monsters. Game over. He was furious. By his estimate, he probably wouldn't clear the Ravenclaw instance until after Christmas. His shield charm was only level 3. To barely get through this fight, it needed to be at least level 4. The instance itself wasn't inherently that difficult. It just required the right combination of charms. He hadn't focused on the shield charm early on. He'd prioritized disillusionment and other spells that seemed more practical for a first year. Even facing a basilisk in a later year, a shield charm might be useless. He had planned to learn shield after covering a range of general spells and had put it at the end of his first-year study plan. Cautious, yes, but understandable. Let's stop training for today. Penelope, the senior Ravenclaw, looked at Aid with a small, surprised smile and suggested they call it. Aid nodded and headed for the classroom. On a nearby table lay several colorful packages of different sizes, gifts. Penelope understood at once and smiled. Are those for your family? She asked. Aid smiled back. For my grandmother and Mia. I've been keeping in touch with Mia, but Christmas is different. I want to give those little witches some surprises. Penelope swept her hair back and said, decisive, perfect. I was intending to go to the Owlery to send some things too. Wait for me at the common room entrance. Without waiting for a reply, she hurried off toward the Ravenclaw common room. Aid shrugged and abandoned his plan to go to the Owlery alone, following her instead. Penelope moved quickly and efficiently. Aid hadn't reached the common room entrance before she reappeared, slightly out of breath and carrying several gift boxes. She had prepared presents for her own family, but hadn't planned to send them yet. Seeing Aid with packages, she decided to go together. Lately, Penelope had been coming to see Aid more often than usual. At the academy, other girls whispered and speculated about their relationship. Aid neither confirmed nor denied the rumors. The unexpected advantage was practical. The stream of love letters to him dwindled considerably. Penelope still held a lot of prestige among the girls. Many who felt inferior to her backed off, choosing other targets. That relief was not to be underestimated. Dealing with random admirers while walking through the halls had been a daily headache. So Aid let the rumor stand. Hermione, however, had seemed increasingly irritable of late. Harry and Ron, not knowing why, kept quiet and dared not bring it up. Black Knight, one of Aid's ravens, flapped to his side with eager wings and snatched a heavy package from his hand. Penelope looked at Aid with a flash of envy, a small pout forming on her lips. Seeing her expression, Aid reached out and, out of chivalry, took the remaining boxes from her. They weren't very heavy. What she wanted was the gesture. Over their time together, Penelope had grown more interested in this junior. At first, she had been curious. Now she entertained the thought of a closer relationship. But he seemed oblivious or uninterested, which both frustrated and flattered her. She couldn't help mentally calling him a blockhead. Still, he had been thoughtful today, and her mood brightened. She hummed a little tune, caught up in the festive feeling. Red Bishop gave a soft caw, snatched a package from Aid, and flapped mockingly around Penelope, as if to show off its usefulness. It even swooped in teasing circles, as though to imply it was far more indispensable than she was. How could a foolish human who can't even hold on to a chicken hope to win the master's favor over me? One of the ravens seemed to crow smugly, though Penelope didn't notice the thought behind the display. She narrowed her eyes, smiling at the two birds, then paused. "Is it really okay to just send them to the owlery like that?" she asked. "They won't get into a fight with the owls, will they?" Chapter 120, Christmas is Coming. It wasn't without reason. Owls are not exactly placid birds, and the chance of a spat between raptors is always present. Ed, however, had expected as much. He had already spoken with the owls. Ever since Dumbledore formally recognized the ravens' place at Hogwarts, open conflict between owls and ravens had all but disappeared. They had settled into a tacit agreement of non-interference. Sometimes you could even see owls and ravens perched together, sharing a meal as if nothing at all had happened. All right. Penelope didn't argue. They reached the owlery and sent off their parcels. By then it was nearly evening. Ed always had two ravens, Red Bishop and Black Knight, to send letters and carry small goods, but using his own birds wasn't the same as using the owls. He couldn't bring himself to make Red Bishop and Black Knight haul heavy parcels all the way to London. For letters, sure, their speed could make a round trip in a few days, but parcels were different. Red Bishop and Black Knight were delicate creatures, little ladies who shouldn't be burdened with dirty, exhausting work that belonged to the robust owls. Even a nearby stuffed troll, as hideous and faded as it was, seemed to scoff at the idea. Did he seriously mistake what ladies are? After sending the letters, the pair strolled through the castle, talking easily. Ed didn't try to flatter Penelope, but his sudden, incongruous jokes still made her laugh now and then. It was hard not to be charmed by a free-spirited senior like her. By mid-December, the castle was quieter. Hogwarts had felt the first snow at the end of November, and 2 weeks later, the grounds and towers were wrapped in white. The Christmas break meant an early holiday for most students, and the majority had already gone home. Penelope remained. She said it was for house duties and to prepare for next year's exams, but Ed suspected she stayed for him. Still, she needed to study and wanted his help practicing charms. As a junior, what could he say but help? Fewer people made the castle a calmer place, and the happiest man in it was undoubtedly Argus Filch. Without the usual throng of students leaving muddy footprints and wrecking the corridors with wet, trampled robes after snowball fights, his daily workload was far lighter. That didn't stop him from being seen scuttling around with a mop and a scowl, muttering curses whenever footprints appeared. Filch couldn't use magic, so the huge task of keeping Hogwarts presentable fell to him by hand, a broom for transport and a mop for everything else. It was no wonder he was perpetually ill-tempered. Any noise or giggling in the corridor could earn a reprimand and house points lost. Perhaps he stayed because he wanted to be near magic, despite the impossibility of using it. If he had really wanted to leave, he would have done so years ago. They left thoughts of Filch behind and walked into the Great Hall, where Professor Flitwick was already cheerfully decorating with his wand. Ed joined in, flicking his own wand to lift a flower pot to its place. With a light tap, the tip of his wand sent a golden ribbon unfurling and drape itself perfectly on the newly decorated Christmas trees. "Beautiful spell, Mr. Ed. 10 points to Ravenclaw," Flitwick said with a grin and a wink. Penelope, standing nearby with her own wand out, protested with mock indignation. "Professor Flitwick, you can't be so biased. I helped too." Professor Sprout came over at that, smiling warmly. "I agree," she said. "Miss Penelope's spell earns Ravenclaw 10 points as well." As head of Hufflepuff, Sprout was gentle and generous with the children, especially when it came to awarding points. Hufflepuff had no realistic shot at the House Cup this term, so she was content to be magnanimous. That easygoing attitude helped keep the younger Hufflepuffs carefree and cheerful, which suited the season. With only a few days until Christmas, the staff were busy. Unlike Halloween, when the castle thrummed with life, most students were gone now. Those who remained were mostly less skilled, so the burden of decorating and keeping the castle in order felt heavier. In the coming days, the Great Hall and the whole castle would need to be transformed and tidied for the holidays. Ed smiled and promised Professor Flitwick he would come back to help the next day. The little professor's face lit up at once.